Happy Families podcast. It's the podcast for the time-poor parent who just wants answers now.
If our children can know that no matter what they do, no matter who they are, they'll be loved, they'll have the confidence to make decisions in their lives.
And now here's the stars of our show, my mum and dad.
G'day, it's Dr. Justin Coulson. I'm the author of a bunch of books about helping to make your family happier. I'm here with Kylie, my wife, co-host, and mum to our 6 baby girls, who aren't quite such baby girls anymore. Kylie, we've had a really tricky question come through via podcasts at happyfamilies.com.au. Before we talk about this question, a warning at the commencement of our podcast that while the content in this conversation is not explicit, we are going to be discussing mature themes, and parents should use their discretion as to whether children should be listening to this one or not. So what's the question, hun?
My 14-year-old daughter says she's transgender and wants to change her name to a boy's name and to be referred to as he and him. Whilst the whole transgender label is a shock for us, she has always identified with boys, friends, sports, haircut and clothing, which we have supported since she was 9 years old. We are struggling with the label trans, changing of name and pronouns. We have noticed that she has become depressed when we call her by her female name, and there has been self-harming by scratching herself. She sends me things about pro-trans, but I would like to read about both sides before making a decision. I am hoping that you can suggest some reading material which will help us navigate through this so that we can make informed decisions. Any other advice would also be appreciated.
Wow, what a question. And thank you so much to the person who will keep anonymous, who has sent this question through to us. Podcasts at happyfamilies.com.au. Every Tuesday we'll be answering one of your questions. Let's start with a couple of words. Confusing and complicated. I think that any parent who's going through this situation is going to be feeling really confused. And it kind of makes sense, because if we just look at the heart of what's going on here, you have a child, you give them a name based on their sexual organs and based on the gender that you anticipate that they will identify with. And then you raise them until they're 14 years old, and then they turn around. And what this mum's saying in her email very much is, we are struggling with the label trans and the changing of name and pronouns. How do you go from calling her to him? How do you go from calling your child the name that you've always known them as, the name that you've got this connection and this history with, to a name that maybe doesn't mean anything to you and even feels like it's, I'm sure for some parents, it's an affront, it's an offence. This is who you are, and now you're telling me that you're not who I've always thought you are. Very confusing for a parent. First things that I think any parent needs to be aware of when it comes to this particular issue are, in recent years, I'd say in the last decade or so, there's been a significant upswing in the Western world, at least, of teenage girls who are arguing that they're transgender and wanting to shift from female to male. There's a genuine shift there. In fact, if we look at the statistics around this, and it's fascinating to look at it, historically about 0.1% of the population have felt that they've been born with the wrong sex organs. So there's a difference between sex and gender. Sex is the organs that you've got, and gender is what you feel you are. So I've been born with male anatomy, and I actually feel like I'm a male. And you, for female, you were a natal female. That's how you feel. But about 0.01% of the population doesn't have that experience. In terms of actual numbers, that's about 1 in 10,000. About 1 in 10,000 people are born and feel at some point in their life, hang on, I was given the wrong sex organs.
So how reliable are those numbers?
Yeah, they're pretty reliable. Well, actually, in the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Psychologists and Psychiatrists, it's like the word that we always use is it's the Bible for people in the mental health care professions. The expected incidence of what they call gender dysphoria is 0.005 to 0.014 for natal males and 0.002 to 0.003 for natal females. So that's well under the 1 in 10,000 that I mentioned. I don't have Aussie data, by the way, but in the US recently, around 2% of school-attending teens are now identifying as trans. And it's higher again in the UK. And 3/4 of those who are being referred to treatment are female, who are wanting to transition to male. So this is something that has really changed in the most recent decade. Second thing to highlight, because of this, there's a whole lot of confusion. there's a big conversation going on about it. And even in professional fields, not just with parents and in families, there's just a lot of confusion about this topic as to the best way forward. And this mum in her email has made it really clear. Every time I fail to use the right pronouns, every time I'm not addressing my now son as a him and calling him by his name, even though I've known him for the last 14 years as her with a female name, what she does or what he does is move into a self-harm mode, which, by the way, is usually what females do. It's not a male thing. So even though this girl is identifying now as a boy, he is still behaving in a crisis in a more female-oriented way. Historically, girls are much more likely to self-harm than boys in that way. The third thing, and this is the provocative thing that I'm going to say, and it's not going to be received well by everybody, but I have to acknowledge it because it's the reality. We've got a medical and a psychological industry that have moved to I would say a 100% affirmation model. In other words, when a teenager walks in the door and says, I have been born a girl, but now I feel like I'm a boy, it's completely agreed with and affirmed. And it's often that person then is able to progress quite quickly onto a program of medicalisation that is very often reversible.
It's interesting, as we're talking, I'm thinking about, we have one of our children was a part of a social group that was definitely experimenting and questioning their sexuality in significant ways. And one friend in particular, literally over the last 3 or 4 years, has gone from being bisexual to asexual to now recognising that she's actually heterosexual.
She was gay in there for a little while as well. I specifically remember that conversation.
At the very beginning.
Right.
That's right. And then she went through the other stages. And the reality is, and I think that her parents in some way have done a wonderful job and just allowed her to kind of work through that process. And as we've seen over 4 years, she has identified with different stages. But if she had made a decision as a 13 or 14-year-old child and made permanent changes, she wouldn't have the luxury of being able to experiment to work out where she actually sits in the world.
And I think that really nails what my great concern is, whether it's this mum who's sent us this email or whether it's talking about the topic more generally. In fact, there's a couple of things in this particular email that we need to come back to in a sec. But when we're speaking about this idea generally, the wait and see approach seems to be better. People say that gender is fluid. That's fairly well agreed on now. But that means that we're going to express our gender in different ways for different reasons at different times in our life. And that example that you've given of one of our kids' friends is the perfect example of that. She's gone through all of these stages. And when we go with the 100% affirmation model, we actually deny the reality that gender is fluid. We're saying that a 14-year-old has identified what gender they are, and it is not fluid, it is fixed, and we need to take medical reparations. We need to medicalize, we need to operationalize, we need to do things right now to make sure that they are affirmed in their identity. And that's where my concern is. I don't have a problem with acknowledging, in fact, it's really important. I don't have an anti-transgender agenda. That's not who I am. I'm advocating for something else. I'm advocating for a wait and see approach. And I know at this point I'm probably sounding like I'm really against this mum doing something. I'm not. I'm just highlighting the complexity and the importance of not going with a 100% affirmation response. So let's take a break. It's been a fairly heavy conversation so far, and we'll talk about how this mum can help her daughter who wants to transition to being a son through a really tricky period.
It's the Happy Families Podcast.
Imagine a home where discipline got results without anyone having to feel bad or in trouble. The Do's and Don'ts of Discipline is a webinar to help parents set limits with love, compassion and humanity. Find it now at happyfamilies.com.au/shop.
It's the Happy Families Podcast, the podcast for the time-poor parent who just wants answers now. And today we are dealing with probably one of the most complex and complicated challenges that parents are dealing with today, specifically helping our teenagers navigate this space of sexual identity.
Yeah, so a mum has written in and wants some help with her 14-year-old who is saying that she's transgender. I think we need to talk about what this mum needs to do so that we can help her out here. And the first thing that I would actually say is that we talked about this at the outset of the podcast. We've kind of got this outcome in mind of what our child is going to be, and we need to let go of that and recognise that each child will choose their own path and it's not our job to choose that path for them. However, there is a very clear and important loving and compassionate process that we need to walk through with our child so that we can find an outcome, whatever the outcome ends up being. Completely detached from the outcome, but a process to get us to the outcome. Unfortunately, what often happens in these situations is that the parent says, hey, I'm the parent, you don't know what you're talking about. You're 13, you're 14, you're 15. You've got your whole life in front of you. I'm going to decide on the outcome right now. You are a girl. You were born a girl. Stop being so silly. And they'll try to shut it down. What happens when we step in with psychological control or even behavioral control? That's where the self-harm comes in. That's where the problems occur. That's why anybody who is more liberal leaning in this argument will say you've got to be affirming because otherwise they're going to take their lives, because in extreme cases they do.
So what is the answer?
I don't think that there is an answer. I know that there are some guidelines that I can point this mum to, and any parent who's got a child who's struggling with this, but there isn't an outcome. There isn't an answer that I can say, this is what you've got to do. So let me share a couple of guidelines.
Isn't that parenting in general?
It is. It's just
only we had a manual that gave us all the answers.
This one's magnified so much because there's so much emotion behind it and there's so much identity behind it. It is a complex and challenging issue. So first of all, let's acknowledge that transgender identities exist. They always have, they always will. And it may be that your child actually is transgender and will need to transition from being female to male. It's a very small percentage of the population historically, but it may be that your daughter is going to become your son, and that is the way she should have been born. We just need to acknowledge that at the outset. It's confusing. It's not what it's what we would call a non-normative gender situation, but that doesn't mean that it can't happen, because we've got hundreds of years of history of this happening in very small numbers throughout the population. The second thing, though, I think is we just want to have a conversation with our child where we say, I'm really stuck. And this is why, like, you've always been this person to me, and now you're telling me that you're not. And it's perfectly reasonable with such a complex and challenging situation for a parent to think through this with their child and to identify the wrestle, to grapple with it, not to grapple with their child, but to grapple with the issue and try to figure it out. And I think the other thing that parents really want to do is say to their child, sometimes situations like this evolve over time. And in some cases, a person will choose to become the opposite gender to the one that they've been born with. And in other cases, they don't. But we just need to let time do what time will do. Some people evolve. They're attracted to males, then they're attracted to females, and then they're back to males again. And some like both. The one thing that I'd be really strongly discouraging is any medical intervention. So if you've got a daughter who wants to do some practice breast binding, that's not going to be nearly as harmful. There are still some harms to it, but it's not nearly as harmful as going and taking testosterone and boosting testosterone levels. That creates irreversible damage. Or undergoing some kind of surgery, that creates irreversible damage. And that disallows the natural process of evolution of gender identity to occur. So I guess what I'd really be saying is we want to be really gentle. We want to highlight that it's confusing. We want to recognize that we don't know what the answers are and we don't know what the outcome will be. But as a parent, you need to be gentle, you need to be honest, you need to process it together, and you need to remember how hard this is for your child. I mean, it is massive. And the closer you are to them, the harder it's likely to be for them and for you.
Those couple of words, I love you, no matter what, they mean everything. They mean everything. And if our children can know that no matter what they do, no matter who they are, they'll be loved, they'll have the confidence to make decisions in their lives.
Tough conversation. Really appreciate the email. If you have questions that you'd like to ask us, you can email podcasts@happyfamilies.com.au. I sure hope that's been helpful. The Happy Families podcast is produced by Justin Rulon from Bridge Media. Craig Bruce is our executive producer. If you'd like more info about making your family happier, you can get it at happyfamilies.com.au.